April 9th, 1947, a Wednesday. In the Texas Panhandle, the sky turned a color that survivors later described as bruised purple. It was the color of a bruise, because the atmosphere was about to bleed. By the time the sun set that night, 181 people would be dead. Imagine a monster, wider than a town, tearing through 3 states in the pitch-black darkness. No sirens, no radar, no warning, just a roar, like 1,000 freight trains screaming in the night. But, for one family, the horror didn't end when the wind stopped. In the chaos of the deadliest tornado in Oklahoma history, amidst the rubble of 100 destroyed city blocks, a little girl was taken from a hospital bed. Her name was Joan Gay Croft. She was 4 years old. She survived the wind. She survived the collapse of her home, but she could not survive what came next. 2 men, dressed in khaki, walked into the chaos, picked her up, and walked out. She was never seen again. This is not just a story about weather. This is the story of the storm that stole a town, and the mystery it left behind. To understand how a child vanishes into thin air, we first have to understand how a monster is born. Let's go back. 1947. You have to understand the world as it was then. This is a world before the safety net. If you looked at the sky in 1947, you were looking at a mystery. There were no satellites beaming data from space. There was no Doppler radar seeing inside the clouds. There were no smartphone alerts to wake you up in the middle of the night. There was only the telephone operator and the eyes of the farmers on the horizon. But on this day, the telephone lines were about to be cut, and the sun was about to go down. It started, as it always does, with a collision. High above the Great Plains, an invisible war was beginning. Cold, dry air, heavy and aggressive, was plunging down from the Rockies. At the same time, warm, moist air was surging up from the Gulf of Mexico. It was rich, humid, unstable. Usually, these 2 air masses mix. They wrestle, and they bring rain, but not today. On April 9th, they met at a line in the Texas Panhandle. Meteorologists call it the dry line. But on this day, it was a fuse. The atmosphere became explosive. The pressure began to drop, not slowly, but violently. If you were standing in the town of White Deer, Texas, at 4 p.m., you would have felt it in your ears, a popping sensation. The air grew heavy, sticky. Static electricity made the hair on your arms stand up. The birds stopped singing. The wind, which always blows across the Panhandle, suddenly died. A terrible, suffocating silence. And for the people of Texas, the monster had already arrived. 5:42 p.m., just outside the small town of White Deer, Texas. The clouds above began to rotate, slowly at first. A lazy churn. But then, physics took over. The rotation tightened. It accelerated. And from the base of that bruised purple sky, a finger descended. It wasn't the sleek gray funnel you see in the movies. It was a ragged white cone. It looked like steam. It looked innocent. But there was nothing innocent about it. It touched the earth. And the first thing it found was the Santa Fe Railroad. Now, trains are heavy. A locomotive is a beast of steel and iron, weighing hundreds of tons. It is the symbol of man's industrial power. It is immovable. The tornado didn't care. It struck the train with a violence that defies comprehension. It didn't just push it over. It threw it. 19 cars were hurled from the tracks like children's toys. Steel twisted like wet licorice. The deafening screech of metal on metal was swallowed instantly by the roar of the wind. This was the warning shot. This was the storm telling us, I am not normal. I am something else. But here is the tragedy. The train derailment happened miles away from the towns. And back then, news traveled at the speed of a copper wire. The people in the next town over, a place called Glazier. They were eating dinner. They were washing dishes. They were tucking their children into bed. They had no idea that a few miles away, a train had just been tossed into a field. They had no idea that they were next. 6 p.m. The storm is moving northeast, and it is changing. The white cone is gone. It is fed on the dust of the Texas soil. It has grown darker, wider. It is no longer a funnel, it is a wedge, a wall of churning black earth. Moving across the landscape at 40 miles per hour, directly in its path sits the town of Glazier. Glazier, Texas. It was a good town, a quiet town. It had churches. It had a school. It had gas stations and grocery stores. It had 200 people who called it home. At 6 o'clock, Glazier was a town. At 6:05, Glazier was a memory. The destruction that happened next is hard to describe in words. Usually, tornadoes leave debris. They leave piles of lumber. They leave broken walls. But this storm was different. Witnesses said it looked like a giant scraper had been dragged across the earth. It didn't just knock houses down. It pulverized them. It took wood and turned it into sawdust. It took brick and turned it into powder. It scrubbed the ground clean. One reporter, who arrived the next day, stood in the middle of where Main Street used to be. He looked around, stunned. He wrote that if he hadn't had a map, he wouldn't have believed a town had ever stood there. It was erasure, total erasure. And in the middle of this erasure, the physics of the wind did strange, impossible things. There was a house on the edge of town. The tornado hit it. The house exploded into 1,000,000 splinters. Gone, instantly. But sitting in the driveway, right next to where the house used to be, was a car. And inside the car were 2 people. They were terrified. They were screaming. But they were untouched. The car hadn't moved an inch. The windows weren't even broken. The house, vaporized. The car, untouched. This is the terrifying capriciousness of an F5 tornado. It plays dice with human lives. It decides you live and you die. And there is no logic. There is no reason. Just luck. But for Glazier, luck had run out. The town was dead, and the monster was still hungry. The storm is now a mile wide. Think about that. A mile wide. If you are driving your car at 60 miles per hour, it takes you a full minute to cover a mile. This is a solid wall of wind, rotating at 300 miles per hour, spanning that entire distance. It is moving towards the town of Higgins, Texas. It strikes Higgins just minutes after destroying Glazier. 51 people die in Higgins. The blast was so powerful, it drove pieces of straw, fragile, yellow straw, straight into telephone poles, like nails. It drove wooden planks through the engine blocks of trucks. But the scariest part wasn't the damage, it was the darkness. The sun had set, and in 1947, in rural Texas, when the sun goes down, it is truly dark. There were no streetlights on the highways, no light pollution from distant cities, just the vast, empty, black prairie. And inside that blackness was the roar. Survivors said it sounded like the earth itself was grinding its teeth, a deep, guttural vibration that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. People in the farmhouses nearby, they went to their windows. They looked out into the night. They couldn't see the funnel. It was wrapped in rain. It was wrapped in dust. And it was wrapped in the night. All they could see were the flashes. Power lines snapping, transformers exploding, blue and green explosions on the horizon, getting closer and closer, like the footsteps of a giant. The storm crossed the state line. It left Texas behind. It had already killed dozens. It had erased 2 towns. But it wasn't done. It was crossing into Oklahoma. And waiting for it, directly in its path, was the biggest target yet, the city of Woodward. Woodward, Oklahoma. 8:30 p.m. Life in Woodward was normal. That is the most haunting part of this story. The normalcy. While Glazier was being erased, while Higgins was being destroyed, the people of Woodward were living their lives. The cafes on Main Street were full. The aroma of steak and fried onions drifted out of the Oasis Steakhouse. At the Woodward Theater, families were buying tickets, couples were holding hands, the popcorn was popping, the lights were bright, they felt safe. Why wouldn't they? The storm was miles away, and the communication lines, remember, the telephone lines, they were dead. The storm had cut the wires in Texas. Woodward was an island. It was isolated. It was deaf. And it was blind. Nobody knew what was coming. There was a weatherman at the local office. He was watching the barometer. He saw the pressure dropping. He knew something was out there. But he had no radar. He couldn't see the shape of the hook echo that we recognize today. He could only guess. And out in the dark, the beast was growing. It was now moving at 50 miles per hour. That is incredibly fast for a storm system. It was covering nearly a mile every minute. It was racing toward the city limits, and it was doing something that nightmares are made of. It was roaring. People on the outskirts of Woodward, farmers 5, 10 miles out, they heard it first. Imagine sitting in your living room. It's quiet, and then you hear a hum, a low-frequency hum. It gets louder. It starts to rattle the dishes in the cupboard. It starts to shake the glass in the window frames. You go to the porch. You look west. You see nothing, just black clouds. But the sound is becoming a scream. And then the lights flicker. Once, twice. This is the moment of no return. This is the moment when the modern world, the world of electricity and safety, fails. 8:42 p.m. The Woodward Power Plant. The massive wedge tornado, now nearly 2 miles wide, slams into the high-voltage transmission lines outside the city. Snap. Instantly, Woodward goes dark. Every streetlight, every house lamp, the marquee at the movie theater, the lights in the hospital, the neon sign at the Oasis Steakhouse. Gone. Total, absolute blackness. Imagine the confusion. You are in the theater. The movie screen goes black. The audio cuts out. People start to murmur. Just a fuse, someone says. Just a power outage. But then they hear it. Over the sound of the confused crowd comes the roar. It is right on top of them now. The walls of the buildings begin to tremble. Dust falls from the ceiling. And then the air pressure drops. Survivors describe this feeling vividly. Their ears popped, painfully. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the room. It felt like their lungs were being pulled inside out. The vacuum of the tornado was swallowing the city. And then the roof ripped off. We often use words like destroyed or damaged. But what happened to Woodward at 8:43 p.m. was a massacre of infrastructure. The tornado entered the city on the southwest side, and it didn't weave, it didn't skip, it plowed. It moved through the residential districts like a lawnmower through tall grass. Houses didn't just fall down, they exploded outward. The pressure difference between the inside of the house and the tornado outside was so extreme that the buildings simply burst. Families who were sitting at dinner tables found themselves, in a split second, flying through the air. One man, a father, was holding his daughter. The wall of his living room disappeared. The wind ripped the child from his arms. He grasped for her, clutching at her dress, but the force was too strong. She was gone, into the dark. The tornado tore through 100 city blocks. 100 blocks. Think about your own neighborhood. Think about the size of a city block. Now multiply that by 100. Every home, every tree, every car, every life within that zone was subjected to wind speeds of over 300 miles per hour. At the Oasis Steakhouse, the roof collapsed, the walls folded in. At the movie theater, the only thing that saved the people inside was a power failure that happened seconds before impact, causing some to run to the reinforced basement. But for those caught in the open, there was no basement. There was only the wind and the debris. And the debris is the real killer. In an F5 tornado, a 2x4 piece of wood becomes a missile. It can punch through brick. A piece of straw becomes a needle. A car becomes a boulder. The air was filled with the shredded remains of Glazier and Higgins. The tornado was using the pieces of the towns it had already destroyed to destroy Woodward. It was a grinder, and it lasted for minutes. Usually, a tornado hits and leaves in seconds. But because this wedge was so wide, and because it was moving along such a direct path, the violence seemed to last forever. Survivors huddled in bathtubs, under mattresses, in root cellars. They screamed into the darkness, but they couldn't even hear their own voices. The roar was all-consuming. It was the only thing that existed. And then, as quickly as it had escalated, the roar began to fade. The wind dropped, the debris settled, and a new sound took over the city of Woodward. Silence. A heavy, wet, terrifying silence. And then, the screaming began. Imagine opening your eyes. It is pitch black. It is raining, cold, hard rain mixed with mud. You can't see your hand in front of your face. You reach out, and you don't feel your bed. You feel wet grass. You feel splintered wood. You feel brick. You call out for your family, and from the darkness, you hear hundreds of other voices calling out too. "Mom, help me. I can't find my legs." The people of Woodward began to crawl out of the rubble. They had no flashlights. The power lines were tangled snakes of copper on the ground, dead and useless. The only light came from the lightning. Every few seconds, the sky would flash, and in those brief strobe light moments, the survivors saw hell on earth. Where there had been a neighborhood, there was a field of splinters. Trees were stripped of their bark, standing like white skeletons against the dark sky. Cars were wrapped around tree trunks, and bodies. Bodies were everywhere. The tornado had killed over 100 people in Woodward alone. The injured were staggering through the mud, bleeding, dazed, covered in the black slurry of tornado residue. Desperation set in instantly. They needed a hospital. They needed doctors. But the hospital itself had been hit. The windows were blown out. The power was gone. Yet, it was the only hope they had. Trucks, those that still worked, were loaded with the wounded. Doors were ripped off houses to be used as stretchers. The community began to mobilize. In the total darkness, by the light of lightning flashes and a few kerosene lanterns, they began the grim work of digging out the living and the dead. And it is here, in this chaotic, hellish atmosphere of the Woodward Hospital, that our second mystery begins. The mystery of the girl. Olin Croft was a hard-working man. He lived in the path of the storm. When the winds came, he did what any father would do. He tried to protect his family, but the house disintegrated. Olin was killed, his wife killed. But amidst the wreckage of the Croft home, rescuers found two little girls, Joan Gay Croft, 4 years old, and her half-sister, Jerry. They were hurt. Joan had a splinter of wood driven through her leg, a painful, nasty injury. But she was alive. They were loaded onto a truck. They were rushed to the Woodward Hospital. Imagine the scene inside that hospital. Chaos. The hallways were slick with water and blood. Doctors were operating by flashlight. Nurses were running from patient to patient, tagging them, triaging them. The screams of the dying mixed with the thunder outside. Joan and Jerry were placed on a cot in the hallway. They were terrified. They were orphans, though they didn't know it yet. Their parents were dead in the rubble. They only had each other. Joan lay there, whimpering from the pain in her leg. The staff did what they could, but they were overwhelmed. There were hundreds of casualties coming in. And then the morning came. April 10th. The sun rose over a destroyed city, and two men walked into the hospital. They were not doctors. They were not nurses. They were not police. Witnesses described them clearly. They wore khaki work clothes, rough clothes, like laborers or field workers. They walked with purpose. They navigated through the crowded hallways, stepping over the injured until they reached the cot where Joan and Jerry lay. They didn't check a chart. They didn't ask a nurse for permission. They simply approached the girls. One of the men looked at 4-year-old Joan. He picked her up. Joan cried out. She didn't want to go. She clung to her sister. The man said something, a phrase that has echoed through history for 70 years. He said, "Don't worry, we are coming back for your sister too." And then they turned around. They walked down the hallway. They walked past the overwhelmed nurses. They walked past the grieving families. They walked out the doors of the hospital, carrying the little girl with the injured leg. Jerry, the sister, watched them go. She waited. She waited for them to come back. She waited for an hour. She waited for a day. She waited for the rest of her life. They never came back. Who were they? This question has haunted Oklahoma for decades. Think about the context. The town is destroyed. The police force is busy digging bodies out of the rubble. The roads are blocked. The phone lines are down. It is the perfect crime. Or was it a crime? Let's look at the theories. Theory number 1. They were good Samaritans. Maybe they were friends of the father. Maybe they saw the girls, recognized them, and thought, we need to get this hurt child to a better hospital. Maybe they took her to Oklahoma City or Wichita. But if that is true, why didn't they ever bring her back? Why is there no record of Joan Gay Croft being treated at any other hospital in 3 states? Why, when the dust settled, did nobody come forward to say, I saved her? Theory number 2. It was a mistake. In the chaos, maybe they mistook her for someone else's child. Maybe they took her home. She died of her injuries, and they panicked. They buried her in a field to hide their mistake. It's dark, it's tragic, but it happens. But then there is theory number 3, the sinister theory. Predators are opportunistic. Like the tornado itself, they look for weakness. They look for openings. What better opening than a disaster zone? A hospital filled with unidentified children, staff too busy to check IDs, a city where nobody is watching the exits. Did these men come to the hospital specifically to take a child? Did they use the cover of the storm to steal a life? The khaki clothes, the calm demeanor, the lie they told to the sister. We are coming back. It feels calculated. It feels cold. For years, Jerry searched for her sister. Every lead, every rumor, there were sightings. People claimed to see a woman who looked like Joan living in other states. There were phone calls, anonymous tips, but every time, it led to nothing. The tornado took Olin Croft, the tornado took his wife, but the tornado didn't take Joan. Men did. We focus on the wind speeds, we focus on the F-scale ratings. We measure the destruction in dollars and cents, but the true legacy of the 1947 outbreak isn't in the archives of the National Weather Service. It is in the empty chair at the dinner table. It is in the ghost town of Glazier, which was never rebuilt. If you go to Glazier today, you will find nothing. A few foundations hidden in the grass. A sign that says, a town used to be here. The storm didn't just destroy the buildings. It broke the will of the people. They looked at the erasure, and they said, no more. They packed up what was left, and they moved away. The town died, and in Woodward, the scars are different. Woodward rebuilt. It is a strong city today. But the older generation, the ones who were children in 1947, they still look at the sky differently. When the clouds turn that bruised purple color, they don't just see rain, they see the darkness. They hear the roar, and they remember the little girl in the hospital bed. Joan Gay Croft became a symbol. She became the ghost of the tornado. Her disappearance reminds us that in a disaster, the danger doesn't end when the wind stops. Chaos creates shadows, and in those shadows, human monsters can hide just as easily as atmospheric ones. So, why do we tell this story? Why do we look back at a nightmare from 70 years ago? Because we have to. The Woodward tornado changed everything. Because of this disaster, the government realized that eyes on the horizon wasn't enough. We couldn't rely on farmers and telephone operators. We needed science. We needed warning. This tragedy helped push for the development of the severe weather warning systems we have today. It pushed for radar. It pushed for the tornado sirens that now wail across the plains to save our lives. The deaths in Woodward were not in vain. They bought us time. When you hear a siren today, when your phone buzzes with a tornado warning, you are hearing the echo of 1947. You are hearing the legacy of those 181 souls. But there is one part of the legacy that remains unfinished. Joan. She would be an old woman now, if she is still out there, or if she died that night. Her bones are still waiting to be found. The storm is gone. The wind has been quiet for decades. But the mystery remains. We have looked at the timeline. We have looked at the map. But a map is just paper, and a timeline is just a list of numbers. To truly understand the horror of April 9th, 1947, we have to stop looking at the storm from above. We have to go down, into the dirt, into the dark. We have to stand in the living room, seconds before the walls disintegrated. You see, what happened in Woodward was not just a strong wind. Meteorologists today debate the exact power of the 1947 storm. Was it an F5? Was it something even stronger? Based on the damage, the wind speeds likely exceeded 318 miles per hour. Think about that number, 318. A commercial airliner takes off at around 150. This wind was moving at double the speed of a taking-off jet. But it wasn't a straight wind, it was a blender. We now know that massive tornadoes like this contain subvortices, smaller, tighter, hyper-violent tornadoes spinning inside the main funnel. They act like buzzsaws. This explains the randomness. This explains the cruelty. One survivor in Woodward, a young mother, was hiding in her kitchen. The storm hit. When she opened her eyes, her kitchen was gone. Her house was gone. But she was sitting on the floor, holding a jar of pickles. The jar was unbroken. Yet, 3 feet away, a cast-iron bathtub had been ripped from the plumbing and thrown 2 blocks down the street. How does physics explain that? It doesn't. The storm defies logic. It creates a world where the impossible becomes the reality. We talked about the roar, the freight train. But if you dig into the diaries, into the old cassette tape interviews with the elders of Woodward, they tell you about the other sounds, the sounds that haunted their dreams until the day they died. It wasn't just the wind, it was the sound of nails. Imagine millions of nails, screaming as they are ripped out of the wood all at once. A high-pitched, tearing shriek. It was the sound of pressure. Survivors described a sound like a giant cork being pulled from a bottle. Thwump. That was the sound of houses exploding from the inside out. And then, the most terrifying sound of all, the subterranean rumble, because the tornado was so wide and so heavy with debris, it was actually shaking the bedrock of Oklahoma. People in storm cellars, underground, pressed against the earthen walls, said they could feel the ground vibrating, like an earthquake. They weren't hiding from the wind anymore. They were hiding from the earth itself. One man, huddled in a cellar near Higgins, said it sounded like heavy machinery grinding bones. He covered his ears. He screamed to drown it out, but the sound was inside his head. It was in his teeth. When you listen to these stories, you realize something. The darkness was a mercy. If they had been able to see what was making those sounds, perhaps they would have lost their minds completely. Let's zoom in. Let's go to the corner of 8th Street in Maine, the Oasis Steakhouse. This was the heartbeat of Woodward. It was where you went for a celebration. It was warm. It smelled of coffee and grilled meat. It was safe. On the night of April 9th, it was packed. Waitresses were balancing trays. The jukebox might have been playing. When the sirens failed to sound, the people inside the Oasis had zero warning. The first sign was the front door flying open, not by a person, but by the pressure. Then the windows blew out, not in, out, and then the roof came down. It didn't collapse slowly. It was slammed down by the fist of God. Heavy timber, bricks, plaster. It crushed the tables. It crushed the counter. There is a specific horror in a crowded restaurant during a disaster. It is a confined space. There is nowhere to run. When the rescuers arrived hours later, crawling over the mountains of brick in the rain, they found a scene that looked like a war zone. But amidst the death, there were miracles. People had survived in void spaces, tiny triangles of air created when a beam fell across a table. They were trapped, pinned, unable to move. They lay there in the dark, listening to the rain, listening to the dying. Can you imagine the psychological toll? Lying under a ton of rubble, unable to lift your hand, wondering if the monster is coming back. This is why the Woodward tornado is unique. It wasn't just a weather event. It was a mass casualty event, a siege that lasted all night long. We have to talk about the anomalies, the things that make your skin crawl. In Glazier, after the Erasure, they found chickens. Dead chickens. But they weren't just dead. They had been plucked clean. Every single feather, stripped from their bodies by the wind velocity. Yet, the skin was unbroken. Biologists later explained that the follicles simply gave up under the extreme wind stress. They found a piece of straw driven into a tire, not the rubber, the steel rim, a flimsy piece of dry grass, shot like a bullet, piercing solid metal. How? Kinetic energy. Velocity squared. At 300 miles per hour, air acts like a fluid. Solids act like liquids. The rules of the universe break down. They found a cow trapped inside a silo. The silo had no doors large enough for a cow. The tornado had picked the animal up, dropped it through the open top, and left it there, alive, confused, trapped in a steel tower. These stories are often dismissed as folklore, tall tales from the plains. But the photographs exist. The photo of the broom, driven handle first through the trunk of an oak tree. The photo of the record player, sitting on a stump, with the record still on the platter, while the house around it is gone. These anomalies are the signature of the F5. They are the fingerprints of chaos. Now, we must return to the darkest anomaly of them all, Joan Gay Croft. In Part 1, we told you about the abduction, but we need to look closer at the investigation, because the more you look, the stranger it gets. The FBI was eventually called in. This wasn't just a local matter anymore. It was a kidnapping across state lines, potentially. Agents interviewed the hospital staff. The nurses were exhausted. They were traumatized. Their memories were foggy. But they all agreed on one thing. The men were calm. In a hospital full of screaming parents and crying children, these two men were islands of calm. That is a psychological red flag. Psychopaths, or calculated criminals, often display a flat affect during high-stress situations. They don't feel the panic that normal people feel. They are focused on the goal. The goal was Joan. Why her? Was she targeted specifically? Olin Croft, the father, was a wealthy man? No, he was a sheep rancher. He had money, but he wasn't a tycoon. Was it a ransom plot? If it was ransom, why did the call never come? The family waited by the phone for weeks, then months, then years. No demand for money ever arrived. This leads investigators to a darker conclusion. She wasn't taken for money. She was taken for possession. Someone wanted a child. Maybe a couple who couldn't conceive. Maybe a black market adoption ring operating out of the chaos. In 1947, adoption records were not what they are today. It was easy to forge a birth certificate. It was easy to move to a new town and say, "This is my daughter," and Joan, she was 4. A 4-year-old can be manipulated. She can be told, "Your parents are dead. We are your parents now. If you tell anyone, the bad wind will come back." Trauma silences children, and the tornado was the ultimate trauma. Decades passed. The rubble was cleared. Woodward was rebuilt. The story of Joan Gay Croft faded into legend. But then, in the 1990s, the phone rang. The television show Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment on the case. Robert Stack, with his haunting voice, told the world about the girl in the hospital, and the tips started flooding in. Hundreds of women called in. "I think I might be Joan. I don't remember my childhood. I have a scar on my leg." It was a frenzy of hope. One lead seemed promising. A woman in Canada. She had vague memories of a storm. She had a scar. She looked eerily like the age progression sketches of Joan, the Croft family, the cousins, the surviving sister Jerry. They held their breath. DNA testing was in its infancy, but they tried to match the details. It didn't fit. Another woman in Oklahoma City claimed she had been sold by two men in khaki work clothes to a cruel family. Investigators dug into her story. The dates were close. The description was close. But, again, dead end. The cruelty of these false leads is unimaginable. Every time the phone rang, Jerry's heart would jump, and every time, it would break again. Jerry Croft spent her entire life looking. She never gave up. She wrote letters. She hired private eyes. She kept Joan's memory alive when the rest of the world wanted to move on. Jerry passed away without ever knowing the truth. And that is the tragedy that hurts more than the wind. The lack of closure, the open wound that never scabs over. Let's go back to that night in the hospital one more time, to understand how two men could just walk out with a child. You have to understand the medical nightmare of April 10th. The Woodward Hospital was a war zone. There was no electricity. Imagine doing surgery, amputating a crushed limb, by the light of a flashlight held by a shaking nurse. The smell of wet plaster, the smell of iodine, the smell of fear. Patients were lined up in the hallways, on the stairs, in the lobby. There were no beds left. Doctors were tagging patients with lipstick on their foreheads because they ran out of charts. M for morphine, T for tourniquet, X for deceased. In this environment, security did not exist. There were no guards, there were no cameras. If you looked like you knew what you were doing, nobody stopped you. The men in khaki, they exploited the kindness of the staff. They exploited the assumption that everyone here is here to help. They weaponized the chaos. It is a chilling reminder that even in our darkest moments, when most of humanity rises up to help, there are wolves who rise up to hunt. We talk about the physical rebuilding. Woodward rebuilt fast. The American spirit is stubborn. By 1948, new houses were standing. The bank was open. The theater was repaired. But you cannot repair the mind so easily. In 1947, they didn't call it PTSD. They didn't have grief counselors. They called it nerves. And the whole town had nerves. For years after the storm, whenever a dark cloud appeared on the horizon, the schools in Woodward would empty. Parents would rush to pick up their kids. Panic would sweep the streets. Children who survived the storm, they developed strange habits. Some would hoard food. Some would refuse to sleep without their shoes on, just in case they had to run. One survivor said that for 20 years, he couldn't sleep if the wind was blowing. He would sit in a chair, staring at the window, waiting for the roar. This is the invisible damage. The tornado takes your house in 5 minutes, but it takes your peace of mind for 50 years. But out of this trauma came progress, the Woodward disaster, along with a similar event at Tinker Air Force Base a year later, changed the world. Before this, meteorologists were actually banned from using the word tornado in forecasts. Did you know that? The government thought the word would cause unnecessary panic, so they used vague terms like severe local storms. Woodward changed that. The death toll was so high, specifically because people didn't know it was coming. The anger, the grief, it forced the Weather Bureau to change. They realized that panic is better than death. They began the Tornado Watch and Tornado Warning system. They started investing in radar. They started studying the sky, not just looking at it. The National Severe Storms Laboratory, the NSSL, sits in Norman, Oklahoma today. It is the premier research center for storms in the world. Its roots, its spiritual foundation, lie in the rubble of Woodward. Every time a meteorologist breaks into your TV show and says, "Take cover now," they are saving you, because they couldn't save the people of Glazier. It is a legacy written in blood, but it is a legacy that saves thousands of lives every single year. And so, we come to the end. The sun sets on the Texas Panhandle today, just like it did in 1947. The grass waves in the wind. The trains roll through White Deer. Glazier is gone, just a patch of grass where a town used to breathe. Higgins is quiet. Woodward is bustling, but if you listen closely, when the wind dies down, you can still feel the scar. We tell this story not to scare you. Well, maybe to scare you a little, because fear keeps you alert. Fear makes you check the radar. Fear makes you have a plan. But we also tell this story for Joan, because as long as we say her name, she isn't truly gone. She is the girl who vanished into the wind, the girl who reminds us that the world is big and wild and sometimes cruel. We don't know where she is. We don't know what happened to her after she left those hospital doors. But we know this. She was part of the night the sky fell, and she will never be forgotten. This has been the story of the 1947 Glazier-Higgins-Woodward outbreak, the monster in the dark. I'll see you in the next storm.